Toxic masculinity. It's a term you've seen getting tossed around by feminists for years now, usually by the likes of Amanda Marcotte, Jessica Valenti, or some other idiot. It's their go-to explanation for mass shootings, manspreading, and women's failure to succeed in STEM careers. Today, I'm going to do my part to help feminists out by telling them what toxic masculinity actually means to anyone with a dictionary. That's coming up today on An Ear for Men. Hello everyone, Paul here. Welcome back to An Ear for Men. Picking apart a feminist idea can be a demanding business. Part of it is the need for a new terminology to describe the work. Over the years, this has come up for me many times when trying to describe the feminist tendency to take a basically sound idea and turn it into something completely stupid and off the mark. One near-perfect example of this is in their unrelenting insistence on describing their belief system with the word equality.
You keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
Another example of it, and the subject of today's talk, is the idea of toxic masculinity. It's a term you couldn't avoid if you were living under a rock. The expression comes out of the mouths of Valenti and Marcotte like projectile vomiting every time some nutcase goes on a shooting spree. Well, unless the shooter yells Allahu Akbar before he starts mowing people down. In that case, it's bigoted to say anything critical of him. What can I say? We always knew these people were strange birds. So let's talk about toxic masculinity. Like feminist, I do believe toxic masculinity is a thing. And today I will give you my theory of it, cutting through all the feminist nonsense in the process.
It's just a lot easier if you just lay back.
In June of last year, Salon.com, a dyed-in-the-wool pro-feminist website, did an article on the subject titled Toxic Masculinity in Men, the Roots of Male Trauma. And true to what I have been saying, they certainly got off to a good start. It begins with a quote from former Baltimore Colts defensive lineman Joe Ehrmann, who says, and I quote here, "The three most destructive words that every man receives when he's a boy is when he's told to be a man," unquote. Personally, I can't think of a message more fitting for red pill men. Above all others, they recognize the manipulation and control that comes with the be a man mantra, and they are quick to tell all comers where to put that message when they hear it. Ask Brad Wilcox. Salon continues on a roll when they move on to the equally reasonable, if poorly worded notion that, and I quote, social constructions of masculinity demand that men constantly prove and reprove the very fact that they are, well, men. That covers the intro quote from Ehrmann and most of the first paragraph. And this is where I mentioned before that I struggled for a new word to describe how feminists take some fundamentally clear thinking and force it to ricochet off a brick wall, sending it off into ideological la-la land. Perhaps the word I'm looking for is here. Let's say they take a good idea and give it a new trajectory. The word is fitting. Feminists, who we already know are mostly eating-disordered traditional gynocentrists with purple hair, take the recognition of the toxicity of socially forced hypermasculinity and take it where? Well, where else other than to another program of socially forced hypermasculinity? I will show the evidence of that later in this video, but for now, let's take a look at how they get there. The wrong direction that feminists invariably head in is based on two terminally faulty beliefs. The first is that at least some of them actually believe they are helping men. They are in denial of the fact, however, that they see masculinity itself, all masculinity, as toxic. You can see this play out in their efforts to assign superior worth to what they falsely believe are feminine traits like compassion, empathy, and emotional acumen. Note the distinct lack of those very qualities when you see feminists approaching anything about men and masculinity. Think of the most compassionate, empathetic, and emotionally astute people you've ever known. Were they women? At any rate, I say this in order to point to the fact that you can't imagine a better, healthier expression of masculinity if you're convinced that the only good expression of masculinity is no masculinity at all. Or if you're simply trying to replace what you erroneously think are masculine values with what you erroneously think are feminine values. That is a setup for more cognitive dissonance than a Greenpeace crew clubbing baby seals to make room for a drilling platform. The second of this two-part exercise in foolishness is the most boneheaded part of all. It is an omission so stupid that it drools and plays with itself in public. For the remainder of the Salon article and every other article that I've ever seen on this subject, there is what amounts to a cringeworthy screed about how we need to raise little boys more like little girls, how we need to get parents to quit favoring the rough-and-tumble nature of boys and get them into a supposedly kinder, gentler state of being. Confusing weakness with emotional well-being, they postulate that suicide rates, alcoholism, violence, and other manner of dysfunction would disappear like common sense in a gender studies course if only boys were more like girls. But they left something out of that rosy picture, and it leaves a gaping hole in their theory about the size of Montana. It is called sexual selection. Now, call me crazy, but I think that if you want to talk about sex-based characteristics, socialization, and consequences, the reality of what attracts women to men might be a part of that discussion. Getting a feminist near that conversation, though, is like asking them to sit down for a cup of coffee in Chernobyl. And if you do manage to get them to discuss it, it will only be because they are capable of more fantasy than Walt Disney. They will insist that women want meeker, more feminine men who run around sharing their feelings all the time. In reality, which is precisely where feminists refuse to dwell, the exact opposite is true.
I'm excited to talk to you today about something that came up a lot when I was in the matchmaking industry. I mean, 10 years in that business is a really long time, and you hear a lot of the same kind of message over and over again. And the top question from most of the women that would ask is, or the top complaint was, how do I stop attracting weak men or needy men or men who won't step up for me?
And there is the big, fat, odiferous pachyderm in the room. Women overwhelmingly prefer strong, capably aggressive men who lean heavily toward being stoic. And yes, this probably does put men at some heightened risk for the costs that come with being needless and indifferent to their own experience. It also makes them more attractive to women because it makes them more able to give women what they want. Now, you might think that there's a contradiction here. After all, if feminists are trying to foster the idea that men suffer from patriarchy that forces them into toxic masculinity, then they really are pushing for a breed of man who is more sensitive and focused on his emotions instead of stuffing it all to make room for hers, right? Wrong. Let's take a look at what the feminist agenda is for men who take hold of the notion of a newer, better masculinity in the feminist mode. While we're at it, we can also take a look at the traditional gynocentric agenda for men. Then maybe we can play a guessing game on where the feminist ends and the gynocentric chivalrist begins.
We want to try and galvanize as many men and boys as possible to be advocates for change.
And the penalties for marriage are so high and the rewards now are so low. First of all, there's legal costs of marriage. There are so many men now who are just saying, you know what, it's just not worth it to me. I'm going to be stuck paying the alimony. I'm going to be stuck paying for child support. And it's not just legal reasons. It's also psychological ones where men feel that basically they don't really have rights in marriage. Women hold all the cards now in reproduction and all kinds of things, and men don't.
Well, that's all true. I mean, I agree with that completely. But it still doesn't absolve men of the responsibility to stop complaining about how the cards are against them and man up and become men, because you don't become a man until you assume responsibility.
But if there's guys in the office, you guys in the audience, we've got to overcome this social discomfort of calling out the misogyny that happens when no women are present. The locker room talk, the bar banter, the rape jokes. As a man, maybe it makes you uncomfortable, but if you let it pass, because you want to become one of the guys, you become an accomplice.
The key is calling out other men. I think that is your duty, and that is, as a man, as a father especially.
Tim proved he's a man who lives up to his convictions. Remember this? When he pulled a fan right out of the audience at a concert in Washington State after the guy got aggressive with a woman?
First of all, let me give a public acknowledgement to the lion-hearted Tim McGraw, who, with the help from just a single security team, took on someone he thought was out of line, all for the simple honor of strutting his masculinity for the crowd and cameras. I should say strutting his toxic masculinity, because that is exactly what it is. Let's back up here for just a couple of minutes to get this nice and clear. What we see from feminists and from traditional gynocentrists, regardless of what values either purport to hold, is enforced chivalry, precisely what most women want. Let me ask you something. When Joe Ehrman says the 3 most destructive words that every man receives when he's a boy is when he's told to be a man, do you think he has a point? Like I said at the start of this video, I agree with this sentiment entirely. But unlike feminists and traditional gynocentrists, I think the matter deserves a lot more thoughtfulness than it gets from the likes of Tim McGraw, Emma Watson, Joe Biden, or Tucker Carlson. All of these people, and countless millions like them, are simply doing what they can to coerce men into the service of women. They are shaming men into disposability and hiding it all behind a cloak of fake honor. Think of what might have happened to Tim McGraw if he didn't have a band of paid thugs on stage to jump in on his behalf. That was a pretty big guy he assaulted. Some of you may recall the video I did back in April about 19-year-old Jason Cisneros, a young man here in Houston who intervened in a domestic dispute and wound up dead of a gunshot wound. He was following the code issued publicly by people like Joe Biden and Tim McGraw, and it got him killed. Cemeteries have plenty of men just like him. If we are talking about a different view of masculinity, surely we need to include this in the discussion. Surely we need to look at problems like alcoholism, violence, depression, workaholism, anxiety, suicide, and a host of other so-called artifacts of toxic masculinity and take a cold, sobering look at the connection they have to socially enforced chivalry and the rigid mandate that men must care for and protect women, whatever the cost, simply because we view their lives as more valuable than the lives of men. Maybe we should take a look at the practice of trying to feminize boys before we send the vice president to tell them to step up and act like real men. I can only guess at how much violence and other problems might be ameliorated if our notions of manhood weren't issued from gender studies programs or, as in Tim McGraw's case, from the trailer park. Toxic masculinity is masculinity that turns inward and harms the man. It is the misguided notion of manhood that makes him feel ashamed of caring about his own well-being more than some woman he just met or doesn't know at all. It is the same toxic masculinity advocated by men like Tucker Carlson, whose idea of manhood is to bend over and take it with your mouth shut. It is the masculinity of Emma Watson, who crows about gender equality while hypocritically touting a campaign that only calls for men to come to the aid of women. No, I'm not buying any of this shit. Not for a second. If you want healthy masculinity, make male disposability a relic. Deconstruct chivalry and send it to the trash heap with other kinds of discarded elitism. End female privilege and hold women to account for their own safety and their own fucking bad judgment. Let's take Joe Ehrman's advice. Let's quit telling our boys to man up, but let's also take a real close and more honest look at what manning up in this world really means, which is to sacrifice on the behalf of women who can damn well take care of themselves. And that is it for another episode from An Ear for Men. As always, I hope you've enjoyed, even if you haven't, and see you next time.